Now, even though the manuals that came in those big boxes were usually of a substantial size and quite a bit of information, consider the fact that you were kind of on your own back in the early 90s in particular. You know, if you couldn't figure something out or a particular strategy, you know, you wanted to um, learn about, you know, there was very little in terms of anything online. You know, basically you'd have to find someone that had played the game before, or just figure it out through trial and error, which was kind of fun. But I always enjoyed picking up manuals like this that often offered, you know, and I should call them strategy guides because they offered strategies that generally went beyond what you'd find in your average manual in a big box game. And, you know, this was essentially the internet at the time. Now, I know, you know, they're still making strategy guides and so forth, but I don't know. I don't think they're quite the same as they used to be. A lot of the older manuals had a lot of depth to them, so that I don't think that has completely gone away, but something special about these, and the fact that you would not generally just get, you know, one manual. I very easily collected, in this case for SimCity, which I wanted to show today, four for the original and four for SimCity 2000, the sequel. And that was not all that unusual that you would actually have multiple versions of strategy guides for a single computer game back in the early to mid 90s. So where one left off, you know, or didn't fill in all the details, particular strategy, another one sometimes did. And so you kind of go back and forth between these different strategies to fill in the gaps. So what I thought I'd do today is kind of flip through some of these, show you what the manuals were all about, and what you would find in some of these different versions. And some of them have quite a bit of overlapping material, and some are quite unique in the perspectives that they offer and the way they just kind of go about presenting the strategies and the information so that you can play the game as well as someone can. So let's take a close look here at some SimCity strategy guides. All right, guys, let's get to the matter at hand here, and that is SimCity strategy guides. And I'm kind of going in chronological order here. And I know that I don't have every manual, so I think I'm missing probably one or two, but I've got four of them, which you would think probably would be enough to master this game. But it's interesting how they take different perspectives and so forth. So this is the Planning Commission Handbook by Johnny L. Wilson. And Johnny actually authored a number of Max's strategy guides, and I always enjoyed the just his writing style was always just kind of comedic almost. So his books were always kind of fun, and this is Planning Commission Handbook because the way this manual kind of presents the information is from the standpoint that you are, you know, a planner with a city, and you are planning its development and so forth, which has it's a reasonable perspective for playing SimCity. And yeah, so it really kind of gives you, it's not just, okay, here's the sort of nuts and bolts of building a city, but it also talks about urban planning. Like here I love a history, urban planning in the past, population bomb, stuff about ecology and entropy. I mean, this is really, you know, it's kind of a fun way to learn. If you're a kid and all this stuff is, you know, new to you, all this planning stuff. Heck, even for adults, I'm sure learn quite a bit by going through this book and learning about things, about cities, about the relationship between cities and nature, and all the good stuff that you have to consider when you're, you know, simulating a city and playing mayor and trying to get a successful city off the ground here. So you can see the illustrations. This one pretty plain, black and white. But again, it goes through it kind of academically. It's talking about population pyramids, even Haussmann, right, who redesigned Paris back in the 19th century. So it really gets into kind of the history of urban planning and what all that history might how that might be relevant for a city that you're building. So you have that deeper perspective. And honestly, I didn't really understand a lot of that stuff. I'll be perfectly honest as a kid, but I appreciate it more now. And I think I did. I think I did still definitely get something out of looking at maps like this and seeing how you could do it in terms of putting your residential, industrial, commercial land uses, and just how to build different ways of building cities, and what some of the big strategies are, what are the big hurdles that you really need to kind of overcome and look for, and had this nice bibliography in there. Yeah, I'd say out of all the original SimCity strategy guides, Johnny's was my favorite. He also wrote some other good strategy guides, including, I believe, one for Sim Tower. Now here's another one by a brother team, Dan Derrick and Dennis Derrick. There you go, looking at mastering both SimCity and Sim Earth. And kind of like the artwork on the front here. But this is obviously quite a substantial manual here, and doesn't quite go into the planning history and everything like Mr. Wilson's book, but it covers all the nuts and bolts, how to play, and then actually it has this interesting section here. This is kind of neat. I kind of forgot about this, to be honest. So you have a little planning meeting. Yeah, that's kind of interesting. So you can kind of pretend, I guess, that you're on the city council and so forth, and having a meeting about what your roles are and all this stuff. That's kind of neat. It's a little bit of role playing there. You never know what you're gonna find in these manuals. I talked a little about SimCity Terrain Editor, which I'm not sure was out when Johnny Wilson wrote his. So it talks a bit about that. And actually, if you look at it, it's quite a thick manual. It's got, 500 pages in this thing. But a large chunk of it, like 2/3 of it, I would say, is SimCity, and then a third of it is for Sim Earth. And I guess these were the two Sim games out at the time. I mean, they were definitely among the earliest Sim games. So it kind of makes sense. I have to talk about Sim Earth sometime. It's not. I mean, it's an open-ended sandbox game like SimCity, but it's much more about just kind of. It's not really about building or anything. It's about just kind of changing a bunch of systems and how they operate and seeing how that plays out on a globe. Okay, so yeah, I mean, that is one heck of a manual, almost 500 pages there. But 2 games, so I guess it's kind of unfair to directly compare those. All right, next we got Strategies and Secrets. It's kind of a smaller book than a lot of the other ones, not in terms of length necessarily, just small in size. Strategies and Secrets. So I do remember this one having a lot of it's kind of hints and secrets and things like that you wouldn't necessarily figure out on your own. Had some really good tips in it, but not a whole lot of visuals. so I thought it was maybe a little dry as a kid. But yeah, just another style. And then we come back to the Planning Commission by Johnny Wilson. And this came out in 94, so it came out 4 years later than the other one. I'll put them side by side. So looking through them, I can tell you that they are very similar, but by this point in time, the classic version had come out, and so it was updated a little bit, but most of it is pretty much the same as it was, because there's not a whole lot more to say. That was just a re-release of the same game. So I know there are a couple of the original SimCity manuals, at least one that I know of that I don't have. I like to get my hands on it. But that's what I've got for the original SimCity. Alright, moving on to SimCity 2000. I've got 4 different strategy guides for that game as well, but I really just want to talk about 2 here that I remember using as a kid, looking through this game and figuring out how to play it. And this was a big one because this is an example of a game that I couldn't quite play when it was released. In fact, I couldn't play it for like another year. So I started collecting these manuals and strategy guides, and learned all about how to play the game before the game came out. And actually, through this book, again by Johnny Wilson with Peter Spear here, looking at more from a planning angle, a professional planning angle, and learned a bit about planning and so forth, which is kind of neat. But yeah, I mean, this is a lot like the original SimCity planning book by Johnny Wilson. It's actually got some blue. It actually has a bit of blue in here, so it's not strictly black and white like the other one. Starting to introduce some color. But yeah, it has a lot of different maps of cities from various historical periods and how those cities were laid out. And again, you're going to talk about zoning and land use and transportation and how to connect that all together. And at SimCity 2000, you also had to consider the terrain and all that. So it started to get a bit more complicated, a bit more to talk about. Although I remember this one not being maybe as detailed in some of the ways in terms of planning that the original SimCity strategy guide was. So I don't know. Maybe that's because Johnny Wilson had to team up for this one. I don't know. But here's Paris layout again with Haussmann and so forth. I actually get some graphs in here, traffic, engineering, population density. So a lot of good stuff in there. And actually at the end, there's this interview with Will Wright, who wrote SimCity, is the original developer. And again, back before the internet really took off, this is kind of the only way that you would hear from developers like that about their creations. And I kind of remember reading through this, and then I think on maybe a later version of SimCity 2000, there was a video interview with Will Wright. But before that, this is pretty much the only way that you really had that interaction with developers of the games that you enjoy playing, was through interviews, mostly in strategy guides like this, and occasionally in gaming magazines as well. So the last one here is SimCity 2000 Power, Politics, and Planning, and this thing is just voluminous in terms of the size and everything they pack in here. So again, this is a 400-page behemoth of a strategy guide. And the thing I like best about this one, and I probably read more of this one than any other of the SimCity strategy guides anyway, is this middle part, this kind of fold out part that has colored nice, really nice paper here, laminated, glossy, at least glossy paper. and Calebopolis. I remember that really well. I always wanted to create a map like this, and mine were never quite that neat. Never got that cool, but certainly tried. And then I also tried to create one of these mega cities in SimCity 2000 with all the arcologies. That's one thing. One thing that SimCity never quite did as well again, or just completely left out, and that is the arcology aspect of the city building. But I always thought this was neat with the glossy pages, just right here in the middle. But this strategy guide was extremely comprehensive, covered just about everything, and I'm pretty sure I read this, cover to cover. It was pretty well written. It's not, it's not obtuse. It's pretty clear. Not as involved in terms of the planning aspect. It's not as maybe academic as the Planning Commission handbook version, but man, it gets into like all of the aspects of how the game works, and the basic strategies that you can employ to build your cities and to build good cities. So really quite comprehensive. I always really enjoyed reading this. In fact, this is not the original one I had. The one I had basically fell apart. It was read so much over the years. And that's the thing. If it's a really good strategy guide, you actually find yourself coming back to it and rereading it just because you find yourself in some new territory in the game, and like how do I do this or that once I've made it to this stage, and then you come back, get your strategy guide back out, and think about it a bit more. So a lot of fun times, both before and after I actually got the game playing. I would kind of be obsessed with these, and helped a lot. Before the internet really kind of took off. This was your source of information for that sort of thing. So, all right, guys, thank you very much for watching. And if you've had similar experiences with your strategy guides back in the day, the big box, SimCity or otherwise, feel free to leave a comment. I always enjoy going through and reading those and sharing those experiences. But otherwise, hope you'll think about coming back to the channel, subscribing, and see what we've got coming out in the near future.